today, and thank you as well to the Winifred and DeVillo Sloan Family Fund for supporting all of our talks this year. To start out, I'd like to acknowledge that the Erie Canal Museum is itself located on the homeland of the Onondaga Nation, Central Firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and that the Erie Canal is located on the homelands of all the members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The Mohawk.
Sorry.
No problem. Come on in. Yep. That's on the homelands of members of all members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Mohawk, Oneida, Tuscarora, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations. We recognize that the Erie Canal played a major role in the devastation of their traditional ways of living, negative effects of which linger to this day. Here at the Erie Canal Museum, we are committed to taking action as best we can to do our part in addressing these wrongs through education and inclusion. So that's important for us to acknowledge. Now, onto the subject of tonight's talk. The impact of the Erie Canal has been immense, socially, economically, and politically. Here at the Erie Canal Museum, our mission is to engage the public in the story of the Erie Canal's transformative impacts on peoples and places in the past, present, and future. One such area where the Erie Canal contributed to these transformations was the role it played in the development of various reform movements. Series where we will examine in depth some of the most cutting-edge research into canal-related history with experts in their field. Our next scheduled deeper dive is July 9th, and will feature the author of Heaven's Ditch, God, Gold, and Murder on the Erie Canal, Jack Kelly, and he will be discussing how the canal impacted religion and politics, both statewide and nationally. Jack will be streaming in for that talk from New York City, but you're welcome to join us that evening here at the museum, as it will coincide with the 750 riders on the Cycle of the Erie Canal bike tour. So we'll also be having some refreshments and stuff for those folks. I also know there are some folks interested in Susan B. Anthony in the audience, so I'll do a quick plug for our lunchtime lecture. June 20th, we are having Allison Hinman from the Susan B. Anthony Museum and House here. And just a reminder, all of our talks are also recorded and streamed via Zoom. But now, that's enough of me talking. On to tonight's main event. Dr. Judith Wellman is Professor Emerita at the State University of New York at Oswego and Director of Historical New York Research Associates. She's a wealth of information with her research covering Black and women's history throughout New York State. We're very pleased to host her today.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight, and to Derek for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. This is a fabulous museum. If you don't already join, you really should.
Yes.
Yes,
I have
absolutely.
to do one quick thing. Sorry.
Okay.
But I agree with that. Join, become a member. All right, there we go. Should be good.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay. I'm looking for what I need to press here, Derek. This is a different keyboard than mine. Okay, cool. There's so much interest now, not only in the canals, but in African American history in upstate and New York State. And this kind of combines both interests. It comes out of a piece of work I did long ago with Lori Duell and Don Papson. Some of you may know them. And it was a little essay which is online called Traveling to Freedom, the Erie Canal and the Underground Railroad in the US. And it was part of a nomination to the National Park Service's Network to Freedom for the Erie Canalway Heritage Corridor in 2010. And that's now listed on the corridor. And this comes out of a lot of work by people all across the state at a grassroots level. And I can't thank them enough. I am honored to be part of them in that group. All the stories that we'll talk about tonight are based on primary sources. And we have a stereotype. People will say, oh, you can't know anything about the Underground Railroad because it was a secret movement. Well, sometimes it was secret, sometimes it wasn't. And the reality is that a lot of stories about the Underground Railroad were actually written down in various places. Here are a couple of examples from Syracuse. One is a poster advertising Harriet Powell, who escaped from the Hotel Syracuse right down the road here. One is a card that J.W. Germain Logan put in the Syracuse paper in 1854. Look at the last sentence. I am myself called a slave, but I will wear no fetters. I will be free. And people knew if they wanted to get help in Syracuse, they went to 293 East Genesee Street to the Logan home, and it's in the paper and you can find it and talk about it. So Syracuse we'll talk a bit about more, but bit of background, most of you probably already know that New York State had 9 different canals. The Erie Canal was the biggest and most economically important one, but there were other subsidiary canals, as you can see in this map. And I don't have a way to put a little arrow there, but you can sort of envision. Hi, Joanne. The Champlain Canal was actually the first one finished in 1823, and then the Erie Canal went 363 feet miles from Albany to Buffalo, finished in 1825. The Oswego Canal comes right in here to meet the Erie Canal in this area. So what impact did they have? Well, DeWitt Clinton, sometimes people call it Clinton's ditches, predicted that the Erie Canal will create the greatest inland trade ever witnessed. Well, he was right for some people, but he wasn't thinking about Haudenosaunee people who were limited to reservations, as they were called, and whose homelands this whole canal system crossed. But for people of European descent, New York State did lead to this vast increase in population and prosperity and religious revivals and reform movements in what was often called the burned over district. By mid-century, 80% of New York State's population lived within 25 miles of the canal. You may today live within 25 miles of one of these canals. Few people have really thought, though, about the importance of canals to people of color, to Black people. And I'm going to talk a bit about why that's so important for people of African descent, not only as places where they settled with jobs and homes, but also as routes from which they could escape from slavery. So this presentation will hopefully help us all understand why they were so important to people of African descent by looking at specific people, specific events that are well documented that relate to the canals and the Underground Railroad. Today, New York State's canal system is part of the Erie Canalway Heritage Corridor. And this is the link if you'd like to look it up. It has 4 canals, the Erie, the Champlain, the Oswego, and the Seneca-Cayuga Canal, 324 villages, towns along the routes. It is now also part of the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. And that network was formed in 1998. It gives a definition for the Underground Railroad that's different from a lot of the definitions we may have grown up with, which is kind of safe houses here and there, mostly big, nice looking ones in prominent places with stories about tunnels, which are totally undocumented. But the Park Service defines the Underground Railroad as the effort of enslaved African Americans to gain their freedom by escaping bondage. You notice one thing it doesn't do is limit it in time. So they go all the way back to Fort Mose in Florida in the 1660s. In New York State, sites that are now currently listed on the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom number about 70. And about half of those 70 sites are within the Erie Canalway Heritage Corridor. So it gives you a sense of how important that corridor and those canals were to the Underground Railroad. And you can also continue to nominate sites. So please do, the more we have, the better. And actually, one of the advantages, besides you get to use a pretty logo, is they frequently have money available through grants if you're interested in financing particular sites. So why were they so important for the Underground Railroad? Well, one category was they were used as escape routes. The canal villages were Underground Railroad hotspots where people could find help. And the villages also became havens for people of color who settled in upstate New York and got homes and jobs there. We have a stereotype that everybody on the Underground Railroad went to Canada. Well, there are 30 to 40,000 African people of African descent in Canada by the 1850s. We know the estimates of people who escaped from slavery were like 100,000. Where did the rest of them go? A lot of them settled in northern communities like all these across New York State in the canal systems. So New York State's canal system supported major Underground Railroad routes. As you can see, the water routes in New York State go from north to south and also east to west. If you look at the Finger Lakes, they kind of point right to Canada. So water routes became important, not just for transportation of people, white people traveling, and the transportation of goods, but also for people who were escaping from slavery. The earliest known one that we have documentation for was Thomas James. In 1821, he was living near Canajoharie in Montgomery County. And he wrote an account, not a long one, but it's on docsouth.unc.edu, where a lot of these memoirs are if you're interested in following them, but it's totally free and they're fascinating accounts. And I'll just read this because it's so clear. My master had worked me hard. I at last undertook to whip me. This led me to seek escape from slavery. His mother and sister were also sold. And that's the two big reasons people leave. They're going to be whipped or they're going to be sold. So I arose in the night and taking the then newly staked line of the Erie Canal for my route, traveled along it westward until about a week later, I reached the village of Lockport. No one had stopped me in my flight. Men were at work digging the new canal at many points, but they never troubled themselves even to question me. I slept in barns at night, begged food at farmers' houses along my route. At Lockport, a colored man showed me the way to the Canadian border. I crossed the Niagara at Youngstown on the ferry boat, and I was free. There are other stories, and here are some examples. Thomas Smallwood and Charles Torrey organized, Smallwood was black, Torrey was white, organized a deliberate effort in Washington, D.C. and the surrounding area to attract people who wanted to escape from slavery. They would meet at certain points, and Smallwood and Torrey would hire wagons and just take them north. And this is an example of one. Mr. Torrey went to our place of deposit, which was in Washington, D.C., got a wagon. He had 15 people. He drove to Troy, New York. And their owners didn't hear anything about them. So he said, Smallwood, I've arrived at Troy safe with the chattels, and I'm now shipping them on board of a canal for Canada. So we don't know if they took the Champlain Canal north or the Erie Canal west, but it's evidence like this. It's almost in passing that you just collect tiny little bits and pieces and sort of put it together, and you realize there's a lot going on with canals and Underground Railroad as escape routes. In Syracuse in 1841, William Clark, whose family had a farm near Oswego and also in Manlius, 3 fugitives shipped on board. You can see where the top of this talk came from, at the old line of packets this morning for Oswego. And amid the hurry and bustle, they were not furnished with a pass. They're Mr. and Mrs. Frisbee from Baltimore and another woman from near Baltimore. We commend them to your care. Another's on the way, and you may expect him in a day or two. The Oswego Canal was connected right here, so that would have happened, right? Probably maybe in this building or certainly within a short distance. Another example of the Oswego Canal as an escape route was in Rome. Arden Seymour had a store near the canal, like 2 blocks from the canal in Rome, and he was known to help people who were trying to escape from slavery. So someone said, I have a wife and children in New York City. I don't know how to get them out. Can you help? And Seymour says he arranged for their passage on one of the Oswego line boats with a captain who sympathized with the situation of the oppressed. And on the bottom here, I found this online, thank heavens for Google. Someone in 2010 found the remains of one of these line boats in the Oswego River that's still there. So they would have taken maybe this boat or another one very much like it. Again, 1851 in Rochester, Elizabeth Smith Miller, who's Garrett Smith's daughter, was on a canal boat with her mother. They found a fugitive slave woman with her little boy, gave her 10 shillings, and not all stories had good endings. Not everyone escaped. Here are two examples. In 1849 in Palmyra, a fairly wealthy Black man named Peter Bell was going on a packet boat from Schenectady, and west of Palmyra, people on board the packet boat brutally attacked him. And a fellow passenger commented, this is the sad part, this sad affair, instead of being viewed with pity by the great majority of the passengers, was entertained with ardent delight, and not one word of sympathy was spoken. And this is a 1842 line drawing of Palmyra. In 1850, one of the most famous and horrifying events occurred, and the New York Tribune called it one of the grossest and most inhuman outrages that has ever come under our notice. In October, William and Caroline Harris, who were coming from Harrisburg north to Albany, they had trouble actually getting tickets in Albany, but they finally did. Traveling on a canal boat west, and the captain was Harold Webster. May his name live in infamy. The whole crew tormented this family, threatening that the owner was on board, that they were going to turn them in. And finally, Mrs. Harris jumped in the canal with her little toddler. William Harris cut his throat, tried to follow the canal boat for a long time, just walking. Finally was rescued by Hiram Hoyt, who was a doctor here in Syracuse, and he did live, and the parents made it to Canada, but the baby drowned. That was widely reported in the press, and you can understand why people call the boat crew human fiends. And here's a picture of the Waylock building, which surely they came right by and right through. Another reason it's so important was not as escape routes, but because villages along the canal were real sources of assistance for people escaping on the Underground Railroad. One of the earliest stories that we have, and it's a detailed story, is 1823 in Lockport. There was a man, Joseph Pickard from Kentucky, who was the barber in Lockport. Darius Comstock was a Quaker, actually affiliated with the 1816 Farmington Quaker Meeting House near Rochester, which I work with a lot, so I have to say that. He was the main contractor for the canal. He hired hundreds of mostly Irish laborers. Lyman Spalding was another one of those Quakers who actually lived in Lockport, and his warehouse is still standing in Lockport. And the story was that these two slave catchers wearing leggings of green, and I have trouble imagining exactly what those leggings of green would have looked like, but I throw it out to you, maybe you have creative imaginations, came and found Joseph Pickard, and they captured him. So Darius Comstock, who's used to dealing with legal issues, goes the legal route, and he gets them to take him to a commissioner for a hearing, a legal hearing about the possible free status of this barber. Whereas the Irish laborers, you don't hear a lot about Irish laborers being really helpful and sympathetic on the Underground Railroad, but these took another route, and as Picard was up there in the commissioner's office, they burst into the back door, rushed upstairs, grabbed him, took him away. and the Kentucky and slave catchers had to leave without their prey. Another famous story that Deirdre Sinnott has written some about is a story that takes place in Utica. And the two people who were escaping, we know Harry Bird's last name. We don't know the last name of George. It was 1836. And that building is still standing on the main street in Utica. If you can see it, it's the second one from the right on that whole street, but this is it. They had escaped from Shenandoah County, Virginia. Their enslaver was a woman who was dying. And she said, if I die, I know that you will be sold. So here's money, take it and leave. And they did. But they were recaptured in Utica. And Alvin Stewart, who was an abolitionist lawyer who had an office on the kind of left-hand building, the 2-3-story building on the left in that block. And Spencer Kellogg, who had a store in the middle of the building, was another abolitionist. Again, took the legal route, brought a legal challenge, insisted that these people trying to recapture the two men take him to the law offices for a hearing before Judge Chester Hayden, which is in the building that you see on the left, the main building. But local Black community members, probably about 200 of them, again, stormed the office, rescued the Harry Bird and George. Jermaine Logan, who later ended up in Syracuse, in his autobiography said, the brave colored men of Utica, armed with clubs, broke into the prison, and after a battle which made sore heads among the captors and bullies, rescued the slaves. And they were taken north and made it, we think, to Canada, and do not know what happened to them after that. But you see a kind of pattern that's emerging that becomes fairly common, which is white allies try to work through the legal system and try to delay it and try to make it illegal or somehow put wrenches in the system. Whereas many African Americans take right to the streets and say, we're not going to go to the law office. We're going to get this guy out. And you'll see that pattern repeated when we get to the Jerry rescue in Syracuse. Here's an interesting story that came up when I was doing a lot of research on women's rights too. Some of you may recognize the Wesleyan Methodist Chapel as the site of the 1848 Women's Rights Convention. The people who attended that convention were rooted in abolitionism. Every one of them, what we know and have names for, had an abolitionist background and interest. And behind the chapel still stands the home of the parsonage of the ministers of that chapel. George Pegler was a British working class guy who became a Wesleyan Methodist minister, and he wrote an autobiography, and he's got a detailed story about a man named Peter Bannister who stayed with him in the parsonage. Bannister was from Richmond, Virginia. And Pegler arranged for him to give a speech in the Wesleyan Chapel. And it's a funny story because he's talking about his experience in slavery. And then he says, at the end, there's questions. And Ansel Bascom, who's a lawyer in town and a Whig, not quite ready to abandon the Whig Party, which is still, he's hoping, getting support in the South. He gets up and he says, aren't you a little hard on Southern slave owners? I mean, they were raised in the system and they don't really know any better. So Peter Bannister, says Pegler, just like a Yankee, responded. He said, well, do you think white men are smarter than, are white men as smart as Black men? And Ansel Bascom said, yeah, they're probably smarter. And Bannister says, every Black man knows that slavery is wrong. And what's wrong with white people not knowing that too? Syracuse was a premier Underground Railroad hotspot. People called it the Canada of the United States. People called it the Great Central Depot of the Underground Railroad. And this is, again, an 1842 line drawing of Clinton Square, which is right down here. Well, let me back up a minute. the 1, 2, 3, the 4-story building on your right is the Syracuse Hotel. And that's the site of where this major story you probably heard about happened. A young woman named Harriet Powell had been brought to the Syracuse house by her enslavers from Alabama, I think they were. And she escaped from the Syracuse house with the help of Tom Leonard, who himself was had escaped on the Underground Railroad, was working here as a waiter. And with William Clark, the same man who wrote the note in 1841 about sending people on the Oswego Canal, and a whole network of people. And she was taken to the home of Garrett Smith. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was there in October, the fall of 1839. It's when she first met her future husband. And Smith says, "I come up to the attic, I want to show you something." So Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Harriet Powell. That was her first, probably real connection she had with anyone who had escaped from slavery. But J. Davenport, her enslaver, was so upset that he put this extremely detailed poster up to try to get her back. And one of the things that you begin to notice as you look at real people and real stories is that they kind of, at least for me, they challenge our stereotypes. I mean, some people escaping from slavery truly were impoverished, had no food, clothing, shelter, were desperate. But you look at this young woman, a bright quadroon, about 24 years of old, 5 feet high, full, well-proportioned, fresh complexion, could be taken for white. And look at what she's wearing, a black dress of figured poplar. And she took with her a green merino dress, one pink gingham check dress, one French muslin dress, one rebuff, one light purple. She wore a small ring with stones in her ears. She had rings on her fingers, gold chase rings, green and crystal. I mean, this woman is not your stereotypical field hand coming through here. Jermaine Logan became referred to in abolitionist papers as the Prince of the Underground Railroad or the King of the Underground Railroad. He didn't do it alone. His wife, Carolyn Storm Logan, who was actually of indigenous background as well, from Eastern New York people, and worked with Onondaga people in this area in their household. They lived at 293 East Genesee Street, which is now this, I think actually the Rite Aid drugstore is closed too, hasn't it? It's closed. Yeah, and it was the corner of Pine Street. And by the 1850s, what seems to have happened was that abolitionists, white and black, in Syracuse organized to support the Logan House as a main Underground Railroad station center. So people came to town. They would collect, a wide group of people would collect clothes and food and money and have transportation available. But the place they would generally stay was with the Logans. And here's some examples. The Logan House, this is the only picture we have. It's a drawing. And you probably have seen the 10 signs for the Freedom Trail in Syracuse that the Preservation Association of Central New York did several years ago. I wrote all these and found all these pictures for them, but this is one that's at the Logan place. One of the Logan daughters was named Sarah Logan. She married a man named Frazier, but she became one of the earliest women doctors going to Syracuse Medical School. So this is one of her pictures with the house. And her daughter, Gregoria Frazier Goins, wrote a biography of her mother, and she called it Miss Doc. And it's incredibly detailed about the experience of the Logan family, and especially of Sarah's experience here in Syracuse and Busti, Chautauqua County, where mother lived. And this is one example she tells of a story in the mid-50s. Barrels of clothing were sent to the house by anti-slavery societies, so there was always plenty of clothing. The train, by this time, the train which parallels, which parallels the canal right 2 blocks down from where their house was. And many people on the train were sympathetic and would lend help to people escaping from slavery. So the train would slow to a crawl, and they'd be taken off the train in the dark, was always dark, and taken 2 blocks up the street, and put into what Sarah Logan called the Fugitives chamber, because it had no windows, so they could have light in there without being seen. Whoops. Frederick Douglass was here in the winter of 1857 and saw a similar situation. He described 9 people that got off the train with him who were escaping from slavery. And he said, I wonder what kind of reception they're going to get. It's the middle of the night. These people are sleeping. They get all this knock on the door. He expected them to be a little irritated about being woken up in the middle of the night. Instead, he said, we struck on the door. Logan instantly knew the mark and called out to them and hold on. And he got a light, opened the door. Everybody was invited in. They lit candles. They gave them food. They made a fire for them and made them feel perfectly at home, says Douglass. And it always amazes me to think about that. And it's one of the reasons that Caroline Logan should be called the queen of the Underground Railroad, because who the heck is making all that food? Who's making all that beds? Who's doing all that laundry? And it really was a joint effort, and both of them worked together. Couldn't have done it alone. Probably the most famous person who escaped through here was William Henry, it's usually called Jerry Henry, October 1st, 1851. And you probably know the story about Webster coming to town the spring and using Syracuse as a way to test whether or not the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 could actually be enforced. And he said, we're coming back in the middle of an anti-slavery convention if needed, and we're going to test this law. And if you resist, it's treason, treason, treason. They came back October 1st in the middle of an anti-slavery convention, and they captured William Jerry Henry, who was a cooper from Missouri, just working at his cooper shop. They took him down to the commissioner, Joseph Sabine, which is right on Clinton Square. And Jerry Henry didn't know that he thought he was just being arrested for something, whatever. He didn't know he was being arrested as a fugitive, quote unquote, from slavery, till he got to the commissioner's office. Joseph Sabine's wife later said that she told her husband, don't worry, we got this under control. Whatever you decide, things are going to happen, and he's not going to be taken back to slavery. That's what she said. But again, local, about 24 abolitionists, many of them white, Jermaine Logan, Black, Samuel Ringgold Ward, who was a major Black abolitionist leader who had also escaped from slavery when he was a kid. They got together, and Samuel J. Ward, who's the Unitary minister after whom the Unitary Church is named after, was a pacifist and did not want any violence. And he said, if anyone's hurt or injured, let it be us. We'll give our lives for the cause, but don't hurt anyone else. But Jermaine Logan says, we're going to get this guy out. We don't care what it takes. And they ended up, they did rescue Logan from the commissioner's office. He was recaptured on one of these canal bridges. They took him in chains to the police station. We're going to keep him overnight. But people say 2,000 people, Black and white, gathered in Clinton Square and stormed the police station. A man from Oswego was at the head of the battering ram that they used to batter the door down. He said, here's the old Oswego. And they got Jerry out and carried him to the home of a young woman, a Black woman, where they managed to get his chains off his arms and legs. They called a white blacksmith who came and took the chains off, Peter Tilley. And they dressed him in women's clothes and carried him over the fence and sent him to the home of Caleb Davis, who was a well-known anti-abolitionist butcher, a Democrat. That was an anti-abolitionist perspective, who kept him for 4 days. And and they managed to carry him then up what's now Route 11 into Mexico, where he stayed for several nights with Orson Ames, whose house is still standing. Then he was taken to Oswego, to the Clark family home, and eventually sent to Kingston on a ship. And he did write back to the Clark family and thanked them and made them, I think, a cane or a chair, which they still have in their family archives. I mean, and the abolitionists locally didn't let it go. There were 20-some people arrested. Only one of them was ever charged, and he died before he could be put into jail. But a local abolitionist said, "We're not going to leave it there. We're going to charge this guy, this marshal who tried to capture him, Henry Allen, with kidnapping," which is what this in here is. Okay. A lot of canal villages became havens for people who found work and homes in these villages. And these are some examples here, again, based on primary sources and specific examples. And I think, again, for me, it challenges our stereotype that everybody went to Canada, because people said, well, if I can get a job here and I find people who will support me and I find a church, I might as well stay. One of the most important groups of people who did that were barbers, and all of these canal towns had at least one Black barber. And yet also African Americans worked in agriculture and businesses, canal-related industries. The most famous person now that many people know of is Harriet Tubman, and she did settle in Auburn, but it wasn't the canal, Erie Canal village, but it was close. If we begin to look at the cities that are on the canal, you can see the ways in which African Americans began to form communities in these communities. And one of the things that I noticed when you just look at this list like this, notice Utica has 170, Buffalo has 775 in the 1855 census. It's almost like the closer you get to Canada, the more people will stay there. I don't know what that is. No idea. It's a picture of a farm family that's not there. I don't know why. Here's an example, though. This is a wonderful story because his houses, at least three of them, we think, are still here. Hanson Waffles escaped from Delaware in 1858 in December. His wife and two kids had escaped in June, and he was going north to find them. And he goes through the office of William Still, who kept the main Underground Railroad house in Philadelphia, and who kept a journal with all these detailed descriptions of people. And here's a description of Hanson Waffles for Willsboro, Indian River, Delaware, with what he looked like, who he was owned by, what he was doing. Well, Hanson Waffles ends up settling in Ontario. He moves to Farmington, and we know the house where he lived. He moved to Newark, where he had his two kids that his wife brought they were able to reunite. They reunited in Norwich, Ontario, which is a Quaker Black community in Ontario, Canada. But then he came back and he managed to get the rest of his kids back up here, and they settled in Newark. They had like 6 or 8 kids. And then he moved to Lyons, New York, and one of his houses is still there. And when his second wife died, he's an old man now, he moves to a small little, like 1-bedroom cottage just west of Lyons. It's on a little hill. And when I first saw it, this is what it looked like. I thought, oh, this is such an important house. It just gives me chills to look at it, but it doesn't look like it's going to last. I drove by it last weekend. Somebody's fixing it up. They're going to live there. I mean, it's just wonderful to see. I'm just wondering if they know its history and why it's so important. But oh my gosh, I just get chills thinking about it right now. But here are a couple of barbers. One of them was David Ray, that he was intermarried with a lot of other families. Marjorie Carter was a Ray, and some of you may have known her. He had a barber shop in this big Greek Revival hotel, the Palmyra Hotel. Another one was Perry B. Lee, who was born in Virginia. We do not know if he was enslaved by the Lee family or not, but he settled in Palmyra and he built a house. This has been built up. This is in its pre-Civil War iteration. It was added to and expanded and remodeled, but here's an ad, P.B. Lee hairdresser on Canal Street. His wife's brother, Robert Williams, was enslaved and went to Norwich, Ontario, this Quaker Black community in Ontario, with his wife, Eliza, and their children. And they would send back these beautiful pictures back and forth. So that family album in Norwich, Ontario has gorgeous pictures of the Perry B. Lee family. And this is one, he's wearing a fur coat. Again, he's not destitute by any means. One of the best documented ones is in Oswego, New York. And again, this is an 1842 line drawing. You see the building with the little cupola was built in 1836 as the market house, and it's still standing. And this is the canal, which still goes through Oswego. In several different buildings, a man named Tudor Grant had a barber shop. He's one of the people that, this is a clue if you're looking, if you want to further study this, but in 1850 census, which is before the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, September 11th, 1850, the census was taken in June. He says, oh yeah, I was born in Maryland. In 1855, after the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, he says, no, I was born in Westchester County, New York. And when you see that, it's like a red flag. If you had escaped from slavery and a federal, census taker comes to your door and says, hey, where were you born? I'd say, New York State, Pennsylvania. I think it's an undercount in this for people who've said Maryland or Virginia or South Carolina, because could have been a dangerous thing. There's funny stories too about some of that too, if you want to talk more, but this is well documented because his granddaughter went to Radcliffe College. Radcliffe did a Black women's oral history project in the 70s, and they talked to her, and she said, yeah, I remember my dad telling me stories about the Underground Railroad in Oswego with Tudor Grant. Her dad was George Grant, Tudor Grant's son. He graduated from Harvard University and became an early Black dentist, but the thing he's best known for, or maybe should be best known for, is that he loved golf. He invented the golf tee, that little thing you put your golf ball in. That was George Grant. And we know he went to the Oswego Public Library because he signed in there as a subscriber, took books out. So libraries are really important. Seneca Falls had another well-documented and interesting barber. Thomas James listed his birthplace in the 1850 census as unknown. Gosh, I forgot. And that's another red flag if you see that kind of list for a person of color. They're just not going to tell. But his wife, Sarah, said she was born in Pennsylvania, which I suspect means I actually came across from Maryland, and I'm not going to tell you, but their daughter, Martha, who was 10 years old, was born in Canada. They listed her birthplace as Canada. So thinking, okay, this guy's probably escaped from slavery, settles in Seneca Falls. He becomes a trustee of that Wesleyan chapel that we just saw a picture of. And his house is still standing right by the railroad track. And the Seneca Falls Historical Society, there's a scrapbook with a really interesting confirmation of a lot we were suspecting about him. Thomas James, having purchased the premises adjoining his barbershop on the corner of Fall and Cayuga, has made arrangements for erecting a 3-story brick block, which you see in the picture below. In this connection, we cannot refrain from bringing to notice the fact that Mr. James, who is a fugitive slave, is the possessor in this village of real estate to the amount of $12,000 or $15,000, all of which he has honestly acquired through his residence here. He's shown that although he belongs to the downtrodden race, he can take care of himself, and we think no one will deny that he has rights which white men are bound to respect. Judge Tawney to the contrary notwithstanding. That's he also shows up. Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes a note in 1852, and she says, I think 10 or 12 of us women, they all adopted the bloomer costume. But as part of simplicity in dress and the bloomer costume, Stanton got her hair cut short. She says, I went to James the barber and he cut my hair. And so there's a connection with Elizabeth Cady Stanton there too. Across the river in Seneca Falls, Joshua Wright was also a person who had escaped from slavery in Maryland, also a barber. His house is also still standing, and both the Wright and James houses are now on the National Park Service Network to Freedom. One local white person wrote a recollection in 1912 that kind of confirms what we're talking about here. The sound of 6 church bells ringing together Sunday mornings gladdened the hearts of the refugees, Barbara James and Barbara Wright. Everybody knew they had escaped from slavery. Nobody was going to report them. And here's another well-documented story that just kind of breaks your heart. James Beulah had been enslaved for 30 years. After a long, difficult trip, they made it to Albany, where they stayed for a while, and he becomes a lecturer. Comes to Jordan, a canal town, about 1848. He's shown here in this photograph carrying a basket of food because he made his living by selling sandwiches, which his wife probably made, to people who were traveling along the railroad and maybe along the canal. After the Jerry rescue, it became difficult for many people who had settled here from southern states to stay. So this is a local, not a local, but an abolitionist newspaper account of his story. It's the 3rd time he's bought a house and lot and he's paid for it and been chased away by slave catchers. He said he felt so insecure he couldn't sleep at nights. He determined to leave the pleasant home he just paid the last purchase money for and took his passage to Canada. We made up a large purse to help him along. I really believe that our citizens would shoot a marshal, attorney, or president as soon as they would a dog. Oh dear, that's sad. But if they put their guilty hands on either of these men, and if that is treason, let it be treason. You can see the way in which the model of these people who had escaped from slavery and were making it, living next door to you as merchants or barbers or farmers, would influence your attitude about abolitionism and about national politics. I think one of the most powerful ways we can understand the spread of the abolitionist movement and the election of Lincoln is by understanding that people of European descent were truly powerfully influenced by people of African descent who lived among them and were friends and neighbors. Many people of color worked on the canal. And here's just an example looking at the Utica directories in the 1820s and early 1830s. And you can pick out that directory listed colored if you're Black. And you can pick out the occupations and realize this canal is a really important source of income and jobs for people. Cook on packet, grocery and canal stable, cook on packet, line of boats, etc. And here are some examples, specific ones of people. Moses Roper in 1834 from Savannah, Georgia, which is really an unusual place to make it up this far. Worked on a canal boat, and then went to Albany and got on a Champlain canal boat, went to Canada. One of the largest investors in canals, who was Black, was a man named Peyton Harris from Buffalo. He came up with a whole group of people from Virginia, and organized this Michigan Street Baptist Church, which is still standing. He had land on Grand Island and maybe in Ontario, Canada as well. And he used them as lumbering sources. And he would take his lumber and put them on the lumber on canal boats. And apparently he owned at least 3 canal boats, the Morning Star, the Evening Star, and the North Star. There's an 1825 Cadwallader Colden picture of canal boats in the Albany, Troy area. And notice one of them is called the Rising Star, but that's before Peyton Harris made it. But I just thought maybe that's kind of interesting. So he became probably the wealthiest Black man in Buffalo in this period, and he made much of his wealth from canal occupations. So he would have gone, or people he hired, all the way from Buffalo to New York City. So every canal town would have had some influence and importance to him. And finally, this final one, in Buffalo, the end of the canal was the commercial slip. And it was a location for, that whatever the canal, that's 15 miles on the Erie Canal and whatever. They would often end up here. And the building that we're talking about is the 3-story building that's behind the bridge on your left-hand side. And at the basement of that building, it was sometimes called the Negro Block because there were a lot of boarding houses and rooms of brothels, taverns, saloons in that block that were especially catering to people of color. One of those people was William Douglas from Tennessee. We don't know if he was born free or enslaved, but for at least 20 years, he kept a saloon called Doug's Dive because you had to go way down into the basement. So it was often flooded, often wet, must have been awful conditions. But he gained a reputation for being helpful and sympathetic to people who were escaping also from slavery. The area now looks nothing like this, but. So what can we conclude about the Underground Railroad and the canals, the importance of the canals? Well, I think it's clear that before the Civil War, these canals were really important, not just for the economic development of the state and the country, but they also were an important part of the Underground Railroad as people used the canals as routes to escape from slavery, as they used towns along the canals as places to get help and support, and as they used the canals as places to settle and find work and raise their kids. It's also clear to me that this is the beginning of the story, not the end. I'm sure there's lots more out there. So I thank you all for coming and hope you're willing to be open to finding more wonderful stories and passing them on. Thank you so much. If anyone has questions for a few minutes, I'm happy to talk further. Yes.
What are the numbers you gave about how many escaped enslaved people went to Canada? I think you were.
I wish we knew, but there are about 30 to 40,000 Black people living in Canada in the late 1850s. Anywhere. Oh, sorry. There's somewhere between 40 and 50,000 Black people living in Canada in the 1850s. So they must have, most of them came from the US. But how many others came and died, or how many of those were kids who were born there, we just don't have a good count right now. Probably never will. Yes.
That was terrific, thank you. Two quick questions. How come so many became barbers? Secondly, was there a lot of resistance? I know some of the stories of resistance groups here in Syracuse, the pro-slavery groups, but can you say anything about the tensions around that within around the canal cities as well as the anti-slavery or underground?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the question about why did people become barbers is interesting. A lot of Black men also became waiters. And in some ways, I think it's a continuation of the skills they may have learned while enslaved. And it may have been appealing to white people to be able to say, or to have a black barber or a black waiter wait on you. I'm doing a study with Carolyn Smarts Frost and Doug Corelli of waiters at the Cataract House in Niagara Falls. It was a world-class hotel. Most of them had escaped from slavery. And they're helping other people. They're rowing them across the Niagara River at the base of the falls. Just for 30 years, they're doing that. And so they become almost an elite group of well-trained people who are making good money. They're investing in land. A lot of these waiters buy property elsewhere. And barbers, as you can see, they're doing well. They're making enough money to have substantial homes and fine clothes. And so I think it was kind of an elite group of skilled workers that fit into probably white people's idea of what a black person should do. And the anti-slavery movement, I mean, that is considerable. You know, I told you the story about the Irish workers in Lockport, because that's, again, antithetical to our own stereotypes about working class whites. And if you can find a lot of examples of working class whites being really opposed to equality or freedom for black people, including the riots in New York City, the draft riots, and violence and murder. And a lot of white elite people were tied closely into cotton manufacturing, cotton distribution, cotton factories here, and we're not at all interested in disrupting any of that supply chain. So it's not a lot, but it's the start, yeah, right? Someone else had a question.
I had a question. You said that a lot of the white European lawyers filed lawsuits on behalf of freed slaves that were recaptured and tried to get them out of jail. I just wondered, what governmental entities would they sue to get them out? Was it the state or the town where they were, the county? Who were they suing? Or the federal?
Yeah, it wouldn't be a suit, it would be a hearing before a commissioner who supposedly would interview people. And of course, by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, if you're black, you can't testify in court anyway, so they couldn't talk in their own behalf, but who would interview people to find out the truth of, was this person really escaped from slavery? And then if the answer was yes, they could be sent back under the terms of the 1793. The US Constitution says something like anyone who escapes from labor in one state can be returned or something like that. I just looked this up yesterday and I can't remember the exact, but that in 1700, the US Congress passed a Fugitive Slave Act, the first one to implement that constitutional guarantee. And then it's 1850, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act makes it possible for anyone who says my slave has escaped to come to Syracuse and say to the local marshal, you've got to help recapture this person. Then they had to take it to a commissioner like Joseph Sabine, who was supposed to determine the truth of the matter. And by the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, if the commissioner said, yes, the enslaver's right, you can take him back, he got $10. If he ruled in favor, and they were all he's, if he ruled in favor of the enslaved person, he only got $5. The abolitionist said that's a bribe, and it really was. Yeah. So the idea wasn't that they were suing someone except for Henry Allen for being a kidnapper, the guy who captured Jerry Henry, but that the idea was to find out what really happened.
So that was like racial profiling.
Yeah, I wonder how it really worked. I mean, you've obviously got a Southern accent and you're black. I don't know what evidence you have that they were not. I don't know. I just don't know. That's a really good question, though. What evidence did they actually use?
Thank you.
Two things.
Oh, I was
How would
just
they prove they didn't have photos of their slaves, just go off and grab some random African American guy and say, this dude's my slave,
I mean, how, how would you prove?
That often happened,
You know.
yes.
That, the other thing is, like, I'm sure you, I forget the exact title of the book, was it 12 Years a Slave or something? The guy who was the violinist, the guy
Solomon
who
North.
basically kidnapped, sold into slavery. How would you prove, like, I was born free and, you know, Geneva, New York, or whatever?
Yeah, you couldn't. It was really a difficult, and that happened a lot, that people to make money would capture free black people. There's a story about Oswego. Some deaf girl was captured on the streets of Oswego and taken back into slavery. She can't prove it. Who could prove it? Sometimes an enslaver or a slave catcher would bring like an ad, that the one we saw about Harriet Powell, that would really describe, got a large mole on the cheek, you know, white, almost white, or wearing a plaid cap or something. They might have that kind of description that might lend some, but otherwise, yeah, I don't know. That's really a good question. I don't know if anybody's done a lot of detailed work on it.
One of the, things that has been covered by several scholars who've studied the Fugitive Slave Act is that it's explicitly written to facilitate kidnapping of both free and people who have escaped from enslavement. Folks specifically to allow Southern plantation owners to enslave anyone they feel like kidnapping. There's, I'm not remembering names now, I'm sorry, but there's several scholars who have argued that that's explicitly in the writing of the Fugitive Slave Act is to make it so that kidnapping people of color is acceptable.
Yeah, and there's an interesting example of in the 1830s, there's a little community, it's a biracial community settled by white abolitionists with black people called Gilbert's Mills in Oswego County. I love this town. Oh yeah, it's wonderful. Well, the teacher who kept the academy was a black man named Amos Mason, who had a fine library. He had married as a second time a woman named Hannah Mason, who brought her son, James Watkins Seward, to live with them. James Watkins Seward was one of these in-your-face kids. He's smart, got a great education. He reads all his dad's books. He learns to write beautifully. And he decides, he goes to Jordan, actually. There's a big ring there that's forging banknotes. And he's got great handwriting. So he joins this group forging banknotes, and he goes all over the northern US and Canada passing banknotes. And he says that he's going to Cincinnati to set up a school for black kids. But he ends up getting down to New Orleans. He is captured, thrown into jail, and about to be sold into slavery. He has no free papers. I mean, this kid's been raised in upstate New York. He's totally innocent of what's going on. He doesn't have a clue. But he does somehow, I think he must have passed a note to a sailor who brought it up here to the Vigilance Committee in New York City, who sends it to the Vigilance Committee in Fulton and Oswego, who organized this campaign of letter writing, of visiting the governor, all stops out. They come, Edwin W. Clark, who's a real estate guy in Oswego, is part of this group. He goes to visit Hiram Gilbert, who's a miller and lives across the street from the Mason family in Gilbert's Mills. I gotta tell you this story, it's so good. But it came from one of his descendants 2 weeks before she died. If we hadn't talked to her, we wouldn't know this. So Hiram W. Clark walks into Gilbert's mill, or Hiram Gilbert's mill office, Gilbert's probably at one of these desks like this, he's working. He says, "Oh, have a seat, I'll be with you in a minute." And Edwin W. Clark says, "I don't think you know who I am. I'm Edwin W. Clark." And Hiram Gilbert says, "Well, take 2 seats then." But eventually, James Watkins Seward gets down to New Orleans again. He must have a death wish. He really does. He says he's working with these other guys on getting vegetables and stuff to sell in New Orleans. He ends up being accused with what he does. He's on the periphery of being involved in a bank robbery in St. Louis, Missouri, in which 2 white bank tellers are killed. The 4 guys are put on trial, and while they're in jail, the local newspaper editor interviews all of them and writes down their story. So we have in James Watkins Seward, at least it's an ad told true story, his story of his life, and it's incredibly detailed. And we also have his last letter, and it's in the Syracuse University Library in the Garrett Smith papers. His last letter is to Garrett Smith, and it's sweat stained. You can see it. He says, "I'm chained 8 feet underground, naked, in a Spanish jail. I'm trying to write you my last letter. I didn't do it. I hold my abolitionist and Calvinist values to the point, whatever." He doesn't say he didn't do it, because he was kind of involved in the edge there. "Give my regards to Mrs. Smith, your loving friend, James Watkins Seward." They take the 4 men to an island in the middle of the Mississippi River, hang them all. There's steamboats with 20,000 people come to watch it. And the newspaper editor sells copies of their life stories in a little pamphlet, which is still, it's online if you want to know the details. I mean, it's just like, oh, I can't believe it. And he was a member of the Bristol Hill Congregational Church in Fulton. He joined the same day that Hiram and Lucy Gilbert joined in a big revival. And again, you know, it just challenges all of my stereotypes about this story. You couldn't make this up. Well, under Governor Seward, the state legislature in 1841 passed a law which, based on James Watkins Seward's experience, which said the governor has the right, in the case of a Black person kidnapped in New York and taken to the South to be sold, to appoint an emissary to go and investigate the story. That was the law that they used to send someone to get Solomon Northrop out of slavery in Louisiana 12 years later, or actually 11 years after the James Watkins Seward story. So it's really all connected.
What is it that they said in the decision, that they could go where?
The state legislature in 1841 under Governor William Seward passed actually 3 laws. They said Black people can testify in court. I forget the third, and the third one was the governor can appoint someone in the case of someone, a free person being captured in New York State and sent to be sold in slavery. The governor of New York can appoint someone to go and get that person. And that's what Solomon Northrop used to get out of slavery. He was able, through a message coming from a carpenter down there, to get a message up here, and then the governor was able to get him out, or he wouldn't have been out. We wouldn't know his story either. But the reason he could do it's related right to our own area, own people. Yeah, Aaron's a descendant of Hiram and Lucy Gilbert. This is my friend from Fulton. Yeah, famous. Yeah, all right. Yes.
Yeah, most people on Zoom are saying, thank you, great talk.
Oh, thank you for being here.
One of the big questions we have is, do you have any plans on ever, writing a book, publishing anything about this? No, I hadn't actually, not about this specific thing. I'm working on a book right now on the Underground Railroad in Niagara Falls that kind of relates to these themes, but yeah, so some of you take this and do it. Feel free. Thank you, Derek.
Do you know that a printout version was made by the Friends of Ontario of the online version of We Took to Ourselves Liberty?
No, I didn't know that.
That when I found one, Friends of Ontario.
Good, yeah. I've done a lot of surveys across New York State, mostly countywide, of historic sites relating to the Underground Railroad, abolitionism, and African-American life. Most of them are online, because I don't think you can separate African-American communities, abolitionism, with the Underground Railroad. I mean, they're all intertwined. So that was one that was done for Oneida County. We had 69 sites, and none of those site essays are up yet. I don't know how to get them up, but yes. Thank you all for being here.